Welcome, members, to this meeting of the Peak District National Park Authority on Friday the 27th of September, starting, unfortunately, mostly my fault, 5 minutes late, for which I apologise. Apologies for absence we have from Councillors Hartshorn, Woods and Warnby. Does anyone bring any other apologies? For any other? Councillor Hart has apparently sent his apologies as well, so thank you for that. If we can move to the minutes of the last meeting. They are as presented. Are there any corrections that anyone wishes to have made to the minutes? Janet Dugdale?
Yes, on the subject of independent persons, independent spelled incorrectly.
Indeed, it is. I had noticed.
73/24.
Yeah, on page 10, the title I'd noticed as well, but I was trying to restrain myself, so thank you, Janet. If there are no other corrections to be made, can I have someone move those minutes? Charles, thank you, and Andrew, second. All those in favour of adopting? Thank you, members. That's unanimous. I've not been informed of any urgent business, nor of public participation. Moving on, therefore, to item 5. Are there any members' declarations of interest that need to be made? The shaking of heads and no. I'll take that as a no in that case. We move on to item 6, then the Chair's briefing. It will be brief. There hasn't been an awful lot of activity, but there has been enough. I've been attending, along with the Deputy Chair, weekly briefings with the Chief Exec. I've attended 2 planning committees and their attendance site visits, as well as one programme and resources committee. With the Chief Exec, we met with John Pearce, MP, for High Peak at the beginning of August for an informal chat about national park priorities and his priorities as a new MP, which was very fruitful. There's also been a Chairs and Vice Chairs meeting with the Chief Exec, again just to receive updates, much in the way that members did this morning in the Members' Forum, on issues that are developing or coming towards conclusion. I had a meeting again with Phil, Chief Exec, with the Executive Director of National Parks England back in August, when she was here for other meetings with other staff, particularly about our AI developments in landscape characterisation, about which you heard something earlier and which we will hear more on the subsequent agenda item. I can't even really remember what my... a local plan steering group meeting occurred in late August, looking at the final iteration of the consultation document, which has gone through the authority processes. I had the pleasure, I must admit, of representing the authority as the guest of Lord Burlington for lunch, along with others. I wasn't lunch, as it were. I attended a lunch at the Chatsworth Country Fair, which was very pleasant and quite useful, because I was then sat next on the one side by Alan, the wife of Alan Titchmarsh, and on the other by the new mayor of the East Midlands Combined Authority, which gave me the opportunity to raise the issues that Phil and I had raised with her when we met with her earlier. So that was quite useful, particularly about sustainable travel in the Peak District, and because of the travel remit that the mayor has, and because of the suggested the suggestion that there's merit in engaging with the other 3 mayoralties that impact on the national park, from Manchester, Sheffield and West Yorkshire. So I think we're trying to instill in those, in the mayors and the mayoralties, that the benefit of partnership with us, not least on the basis that, as I think I might have said before, any unsustainable travel into the Peak District from those mayoralties is an unsustainable travel journey within those mayoralties. So there's, it's a combined interest, a joint interest in tackling those. We had a fruitful meeting, myself and Phil and other officers with representatives from Derbyshire County Council about the delivery and the content and delivery of the National Park Management Plan and the differing responsibilities and how they've been arrived at. And I think that we were able to iron out some of the misunderstandings perhaps that have occurred, but also some of the communication channels that need to both be maintained and perhaps created between differing representatives on this authority and their communication channels within not just DCC but other organisations. It's perhaps something that we might need to scrutinise in a bit more detail in future. Along with the Deputy Chair and some of the other chairs and vice chairs, we attended a part of the wider management team meeting at Overhaddon Hall a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of brainstorming was occurring in ways in which, and which Phil has referred to, I think, already, and probably refer to again, ways in which the authority might progress, and not least in income generation, but in other areas as well. Oh yes, I attended planning training last week, and whilst it is focused on those members of planning committee, it's a very useful couple of hours to spend in understanding the whys, wherefores, some of the issues behind the planning process and how and what we have to deliver, and perhaps more importantly why we have to deliver. And then, as Phil has already referred to, as I think I mentioned as well, along with James as Deputy Chair, Hannah, and with Rachel Bradley from one of our planning assistants, we attended the National Parks UK biennial conference in Newcastle on Tyne, which was focused, as I said before, on access and accessibility. There was a range of papers and presentations, some of which were extremely provocative. They were all thought-provoking, and we are in the process. We will be receiving copies of the slides that were used in all these presentations, and it's our intention to provide more detailed feedback to members along with some of the slides. Not all will be appropriate, but it also, having only got back yesterday at 5:30, we haven't really had a chance to assimilate all the things that we were being presented with, but we would certainly like to expose members to some of the issues and solutions that were presented at the conference, if only to get your reactions as well. And I think on that note, I'll shut up. And it was just for information, so I propose that we move on to the next item, which is any feedback there might be on the Chief Exec's report. You may indeed.
Hello, everyone. So you've seen the report. Just one thing I wanted to add, because I'm kind of looking around the room, I realise there's quite a few new members here. So just for a bit of context, I talk about the UK National Parks UK Comms Unit. The reason we are quite involved with that is that we are the host authority for this comms unit. So we bid for and won the hosting of the UK comms unit, which is why I'm quite heavily involved now in working out where that goes next with the director leaving. And it's a comms unit that was designed to do communications for all 15 national parks with all of our differences, all of our different kind of arrangements with our different devolved governments, all of our different visitor types, as well as it then had a stream that delivers National Parks England communications functions and communications for National Parks Partnerships, which mainly deals with large kind of corporate deals. So it's quite a complex unit, and I just wanted to make it clear in case you were thinking, why are we so involved with that we are the host body for that. And the other thing, just to add, since the paper was written really, is following the Landscapes Connections, the National Lottery funding, where we had the workshop, we have formed our working group now, and we will be taking forward the ideas for a bid. Rachel's going to be on that group as in your other role, but that group now is a small group, is going to try and look at how we look at what's a £10 million opportunity for us if we can secure the right project and be successful.
Okay, thank you, Phil. The only thing I forgot to say in my briefing about the National Parks UK conference, organised by the Northumberland National Park, the organisation was frighteningly efficient. It was scary, but anyway, sorry. We move on to... I just...
Next, you started a minute, 5 minutes late.
Yep. Almost. But anyway, we move on to item 8. There is no paper, but there is Simon Geeky, who's going to do a presentation on the landscape AI. Simon.
Good afternoon, everybody. First thing I need to say is I'm not David Alexander. Our David is unwell at the moment, so you've got me in as an imposter to talk about this project, which I was involved in, so I can take you through it. It's important to start at the beginning. This was a project which David led completely. He designed it, worked through the whole thing. It's an amazing piece of work. Worked very closely with lecturers at Cranfield University, Daniel Sims, a senior lecturer there, and with a PhD student called Thijs van der Pla, who's now Dr. Thijs van der Pla, who now works at CEH, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. So the talk we're going to go through today, I'm going to talk a bit about why scale is important and kind of why David thought this project needed to be done. I'll go through some of the methodology of training the AI. If anybody wants to talk about coding, I'm not the right person to talk about coding to. Okay, so I know nothing about coding. And then we'll showcase and go through how some of the results work, and then talk about next steps, which some colleagues have spoken about earlier today in the forum, in fact. So why does scale matter? Well, at landscape scales, habitats with high biodiversity are often small and sparsely distributed. They're patchily distributed throughout the environment. We've got big chunks of stuff, but we've also got small patches within a broader matrix of the farmed lands that we have. And if we've got really coarse data, if we can't see that detail in the landscape, it makes it very difficult to monitor the progress on those pieces of land. It makes it very difficult to us to understand the condition of those places and where the opportunities might lie and where the difficulties might lie. So understanding landscapes at a patch scale is really very useful for all kinds of things. And you've heard some of that in the Norwich Hill project this morning, and some of that in the Elms project. When we're looking at small patches of land at a farm scale, how do we understand what's there already? How do we have proper discussions about what might be possible in those places? So, we've got a bit more about scale here. Most of our national data sets, the data sets that we talk about when we talk about the targets and outcomes framework, when we talk about how we look nationally at progress against the Environment Improvement Plan, are based on based on the Sentinel satellite data, and that data comes in at 10-metre resolution. So each pixel is 10 metres big. When you look at a kilometre square, this is a representation. This is a sort of a representative kilometre square here at 10-metre resolution. With your eyes, you don't really see very much. There's not a lot of detail there. At national scales, this kind of stuff works brilliantly. So if you're looking across the whole of the UK and you're trying to understand the distribution of major habitats across the UK, 10-metre scale is fantastic because it gives you that kind of resolution when you're making that kind of big scale strategic decisions, trying to understand where everything is. But it's actually difficult to distinguish landscape features, the features that build up our special qualities, at that kind of scale. So we need some way of actually seeing those features and understanding how those features are distributed in the landscape. So when you look at a 12 by 12, a much higher resolution photograph, this is the 12 centimetre photography, aerial photography the model was used. We used with this model to develop the AI map. You see a lot more nuance in that landscape. We can see quite easily that there's trees outside of woodland and hedgerows there. We can see that there's patches of rough grassland, or small patches distributed across the whole of the image there. There are patches of wet grassland as well, all sort of important little patches of habitat across that landscape. And we can also see that there's a river running through the middle of it as well, which is quite important. So we've got a lot more nuance in that, which is really useful to us at landscape scales, at smaller scales than a national picture allows. And that's what the AI we trained picks up. That's what it looks for, and that's what it finds. So this is actually an image from our AI map of that same kilometre square. So moving on to how we actually train the AI. It's important to realise that there's enormous variation in natural habitats in vegetation stands. Variation between them, different times of the year, different aspects, different times of the day. So one example here, this is improved grassland. And this is a sort of just a representative set of what improved grassland can look like at any given moment in the year. Starting on this left-hand side, it's just been cut. The next one, it's a few weeks after it's been cut. The next one is actually sheep grazed. There's some sheep in the top right-hand corner there. You can't quite see them at this scale. Then we've got cows grazing. That little orange dot is a farmer harrowing that field, and then another field on the side. So that's all that variation just in one relatively uniform type of land cover, one relatively uniform type of vegetation. Put on top of that the fact, this little diagram down in the bottom here demonstrates that most of the aerial photography we got was collected in different years, because obviously you've got to wait for a clear day, you've got to wait for the right flight path of the plane collecting the information. So that actually the top there, the green, is collected in 2019, in March, and at the bottom there it's collected in June in 2022. So we've got a difference in years as well. And as everyone knows, different winters, different springs have different effects on flowering times and growth times and those kind of things. So we had to teach our AI in a way that make sure it understood all that variation just generally across habitats, but also the variation between years. And the next thing we had in the middle there, a little slide, a little bit of the Peak District there. Obviously the Peak District is made up of different bedrocks in different areas. So we've got the Dark Peak, the White Peak and the Southwest Peak generally, and that has an effect on the vegetation as well. So our sampling had to take account of all of those different levels of variation. So we sampled across all the areas of the Peak District, we sampled across all the time series of photography, and within those samples we sampled the range of the appearance of habitats as we go across. Quite a detailed piece of work. The other thing at the end there, so we have to balance these data to train it in the model as well. So to get into AIs a little bit, you've got to imagine that an AI is a tiny child. It knows nothing. So if you teach it one thing, it'll learn about that thing. And if you teach it a lot about one thing and a little bit about another thing, it'll think the world is made of mostly this stuff, and that stuff I don't really need to care about. So we have to balance the data across, the training data across that. So we have to make sure that we're showing it a proper representation of the things we expect it to find in the landscape in this case. The final bit of human in this is at the landscape scale, we're using the AI to predict this our landscape with using very small amounts of data. This was the whole point. The original survey done in the 80s was done by a large team of experts, took months to cover all the protected landscapes. And it was a one-off activity using aerial photography, really careful work. And we haven't got resources for that anymore. We needed to find a way of doing it better than that. So with each of our kilometre squares, we then subsampled these little red squares here, are 64 metres by 64 metres, and we'll come to why they're that size in a minute. And then David and I principally digitised those to teach the AI. So we went in, drew around the habitats, went out in the field, checked it, asked colleagues in the conservation team to double check our work to make sure that we were getting the right things identified, so that we could train the AI, we could show it and say, look, this is what we want you to look for in the wider landscape. And we did that across a whole set of tiles across the landscape. But effectively, we hand digitised 1% of the total area of the Peak District National Park, and then it used that 1% to predict the entire landscape cover for the national park. So as you can see, the efficiency there, if you can get that to work well across landscapes. It's important to realise that AIs can't learn out of context. They can't learn independently, really, in the same way that perhaps humans do. So if it sees something you haven't taught it, it doesn't really know what it is, and it'll guess. So we actually ruled, starting with the image on the left here, we ruled out urban areas. We essentially what we called urban were roads, car parks, houses, villages, that kind of stuff. We took those out of the equation because there's so much variability there. We wanted to focus on the land cover at a wider scale. So we didn't show it many cars, basically. So when the AI looked at these cars, it looked for things that it had learnt about that might be a bit like cars. And it worked out that it was on improved grassland, which is probably about right, but then also that the nice red cars were rush pasture. So it gets a little bit confused by those kinds of things. So you just got to be aware of some of these errors that might be in there. We didn't teach it about parkland and specimen trees. This is a large red acer there. So the AI looked for what the large red acer looked a bit like, and it decided it was upland heath, which is fairly reasonable. It's roughly the same colour. So just to be aware of some of that stuff. We've also got the cricket square here, which is quite interesting, this one, because this is amenity grassland. It goes beyond being improved grassland in many ways, but it looks a lot like improved grassland. And the AI thought, okay, that's improved grassland. And the final one is fields. We don't have in our photography or in the Peak District many arable fields as such, so we didn't really train it on arable fields. But obviously there are grassland lays, there are times when people do work in the fields, and this is a very finely tilled field there. And again, the AI didn't know about those, so it looked for something that was a bit like it, and it thought it looked a bit like Narda stricta, so it called it upland grassmoor. So that's what we end up with there. So we just got to be aware of some of those potential mistakes that an AI make, which are the same kind of mistakes that a human might make as well if they're not fully conversant in some of the landscape, or just transcription errors in your notes, those kind of things. So what's the methodology behind how we work this? We used a multi-stage process. So the 64 by 64 metre squares, that size of square we used for the training data, the entire Peak District was broken up into that. So we have 380,000 of those, and they go through the process one at a time. So you feed it a colour image, an RGB image, and the first thing it does, and if you imagine you're teaching a child, you're sort of saying to a child, right, I want you to look out the window, what can you see? And you can see some grass, and you can see some trees. So the AI does exactly the same thing, and the first thing it looks at, and it says, oh, I can see Class E, which is grass, and I can see some trees, which is Class C. So we've got that bit. Then we say to it, then the next stage is, but what kind of grass or what kind of trees can you see? So then it runs it through again, and it looks and it says, oh, well, I can see trees, but I can see some deciduous trees, and I can see some scrub. And that grassland is improved grassland because it's nice and green, this stuff just here. And I can also see a road, which is good. And then the final stage, we gave it other data to look at, contextual data. So we gave it things like height data or soil data to go right down to those final detailed habitat descriptions. So in the last stage there, it then decided that it already worked out what the grasslands were, what sort of grasslands were there, but then it had a further look at the scrub. And it thought, that's not just scrub, it's the scrub at the edge of a woodland. So it got that information as it was going through. So that's the kind of schema as it works across all 380,000 squares. And you can see there's a sort of a hierarchical way of approaching it. And that's the way it tries to understand the world. So here are some of our model predictions from the first sweep of this model. And you can see the aerial photography above and the imagery that's been produced by the AI below. And you can see that, yeah, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good mix of what you would expect to see there. If you look at image 2 there, which is probably the easiest one to see at a rub at this scale, that's obviously of a sort of a wood pasturey woodland. There's grassland there with scattered with trees, and it's got it. It's worked out that you've got there E2B, which is our rough pasture classification, and C1, which is broadleaf forest. It's got that mix really nicely. The last one as well, far right-hand side there, is a sort of classic White Peak scenario where you've got improved grassland, some hawthorn trees. You can see they're in flower there, so we have to teach you the difference between trees in flower and trees not in flower, and some wet sort of marshy grassland there as well. Really quite accurate predictions of what's going on there. Work to be done, but pretty accurate. So, how does that work at landscape scale? So we're looking at a landscape scale picture here, lots going on in this picture, and what sort of things do we want to pull out of this landscape? Maybe we're having a discussion about a landowner or a farmer around an agricultural improvement scheme. We're trying to assess ecosystem services in this area. We're trying to assess what the biodiversity potential might be. So we can quickly look at it and we can see that we've got some rough grassland and scrub. We've got a mixture of planted woodlands, coniferous plantation, broadleaf trees as a band around those. We've got a little, as David said to me the other day, a little cheeky patch of rush pasture and some single trees across that landscape. We've also got other bits in there, rough grasslands, some other scrub and some hedgerows. So we're pulling out the things that are of interest in there. So what does the AI see? Well, when the IIC scans this, it gets it. It gets the coniferous woodland, it gets the band of broadleaf woodland around the outside of the coniferous woodland. It picks up those areas of the red stuff is the rush pasture and the other bits of stuff there. So we're seeing this image is very much what the ground it looks like on the ground compared to the sort of blocking national scale stuff. This is a sort of image where you can have good conversations with a landowner or with a potential funder or an investor around the potential of a landscape. It sort of feeds those kinds of discussions at this kind of nuanced level. Looking at a bit of moorland, we can all recognise moorland now. It's not Acer trees, not like the AI. So this is a bit of heather here and some scrub and various bits of bracken and things like that. Again, the AI picks up all that really nicely. David does beautiful presentations. His colour choice is always great. This is good stuff. And again here, we've got upland brush and bracken. Now this image is quite interesting. Well, interesting. It's interesting to me. There's a faint line down here. If anybody can spot that. This is two different time series. So this is an earlier photograph than that one there. And just to illustrate that, if we look at this in infrared, which we use with the AI as well, can you see that the right-hand side is a bit redder? This bit up here, so we've got more of a red colour. So this side down here, and that's about chlorophyll concentration in cells. They reflect more red light when there's more chlorophyll there, so that's slightly later in the season than this photograph. Nevertheless, the AI got the hang of that, and you can see the split of habitats across that area as well. So that's a bit of a showcase. You've seen this slide. Jackie nicked this slide, or Sue nicked it. I think it was Sue that pinned it. So, again, just to reiterate what was said this morning, what's this for? Why is it useful? Well, the national scale data on the right-hand side, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's brilliant. It's really accurate at national scales. But when we're talking about landscape recovery bids, when we're talking about that sort of nuance around private finance, all those kinds of things, we need that nuanced information to be able to have informed conversations about opportunity or what the constraints are for someone who's actually managing the land and trying to make a living out of it. So we look at the photograph in the middle and we can see a much more nuanced representation of the landscape. And also on the left-hand side here, as you've already seen, in terms of tree cover, which is one of our targets in the outcomes framework, by the way, when we're looking at this, currently the outcomes framework thinks we've got 0%, obviously we chose this, by the way, but thinks we've got 0% in that patch there, and actually when you look at the real world, there's a 13% of tree cover in that area, which makes for a very interesting local discussion about where the opportunity lies, how much carbon is being held in the landscape, what might happen in the future if we start modelling climate change, modelling species population movements across these landscapes. How are we going to do that? How are we going to use that? So that's what this kind of thing is for. A bit more looking at landscape scale data. One of the things we're interested in obviously is habitat complexity. Those of you that were able to come to the climate change workshop, we talked about how more diverse and complex systems are more resilient and more future-proof, or are able to transition through different sequences. They're more resistant to fire, they're more resistant to flood, they're better at holding water in the landscape, all those kinds of things. So actually understanding complexity is really useful. And having spent years as a young ecologist walking around with a tape measure and a weather writer, getting soaking wet, trying to measure things, this sort of stuff, being able to do this quickly means that we can sort of say, well, this is the important bit, go and look at that bit. That's the bit we want you to go and see. So it gives us a chance to understand complexity at big scales, when previously that would have been quite a difficult thing to do. Very valuable, but very difficult to do. And finally, to next steps. So we've updated the whole land cover map with that first run for the Peak District from the 1983 version. It's a far more precise map. There are some minor issues around accuracy in places, but basically it's scored out as accurate as a field surveyor across the piece. What's interesting about that, of course, is the AI is always consistent. You don't get that difference you get sometimes between field surveyors. So we're always going to get a consistent picture there. As Jackie and Sue talked about at Morridge Hill and North Lees, we're in the process of developing a more accurate run of the AI. It's been developed a bit further, which is now being used to as a baseline for understanding natural capital. So we're looking at sediment retention within the system, seasonal water yield across there, where carbon is currently being stored, where it could be stored, and looking at the role of the landscape in managing the quality of water. On top of that, staff at CEH under James Bullock, his team, are looking at modelling different aspects of the landscape in terms of species. So they're using a thing called the FORP model, which looks at herpetofauna, reptiles and amphibians, some invertebrates, some plants and some birds, how they actually might utilise that landscape in a modelled way. So if Jackie goes out there and says, right, okay, we're going to plant more trees here, or we're going to get more rough grassland here, or more wet bits there, we're going to restore the peat, what does that actually do when you model how species actually use that landscape? And that's also within partnership with Daniel at the CEH as well. So the CEH are involved in taking Cranfield rather are taking forward the renewal of some of the programming and some of the code writing there. We produced a paper. I was very pleased with this because it's the first time I've ever been published. Which David and Tice led on, obviously. It wasn't just for fun. This has raised the profile of the work within the research community. So that means that we actually are in the process of attempting to get some further research funding to support further development of the model. Its utility obviously doesn't just apply to this protected landscape. It could be used across all protected landscapes, and we're looking at how we can actually expand that out to do that, because obviously other protected landscapes have different habitats mixes to that which we have, so there's a little bit more work to be done there. So this is actually things like this help to raise the profile of the work and raise the sort of scientific credentials of the work that we're doing here. And that's the end of the talk. Guess who?
Thank you, Simon, for that really thorough and, for me, clear presentation. I don't understand most of it, but it's damn clear. I was going to ask for questions. There's a flurry of hands. Matt first, then Janet, and I beg your pardon, Ruth. Then.
Yeah, you've said about the other protected landscapes, and I've sort of broached this with David before because of where we sit in terms of the local nature recovery strategies. We've got 6 local nature recovery strategies. You know, I deal with the Derbyshire one. They won't use your data, which is much better than the data that they are using because it only covers the national park. It doesn't cover the rest of the county. How easy is it to do the 6 counties that our nature plan feeds into the local nature recovery strategies for? Because you know that would make this significantly more usable. Because you know the local nature recovery strategies are going to have a significant impact on what happens in the national park and outside it.
It's relatively straightforward. The only barrier is funding, and we're in discussion with the nature recovery strategies at the moment around trying to resolve that. Sarah's leading on that, and Sarah Bird from this morning is leading on that. We're hopeful of a decent result there. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Matthew. If we're going to pull together nature recovery at a Peter Street level that rolls out into those areas, we need to be using the same baseline data. Absolutely. And it's doable. It's perfectly doable.
Just needs the resources.
Needs the resources.
Yeah. Okay. Ruth Swetnam.
Thank you, and thanks for a very nice presentation, and well done on getting it all out there and published. My comment actually just follow a little bit on from Matt's, in that I would imagine if I was the CEO and the senior leadership team of any national park in the UK, I would want that. Are there any opportunities for you to be commissioned to earn some money to do this process for the other national parks and protected landscapes? It's intellectual property that you have, that we as the national park have supported. Can we capitalise on it? Gosh, that makes me sound very monetaristic, doesn't it? And I have one more comment, but...
We've talked a lot to other officers and other people in the National Parks Authority movement and the protected landscape movement. We've talked to DEFRA, we've talked to Natural England. We've spent a lot of time doing that. And I think that, yeah, absolutely, Ruth, there is the opportunity there. But again, it relies on people wishing to buy into that approach. Everyone loves the map. And then when you start talking about money.
I suppose the comment is don't give away the intellectual property rights on it, because that is really important. And there is a technical question actually about be careful about setting KPIs on areas from your AI, because the linear areas, what you're recording in those linear patches is actually the area of the tree canopy, not the area on the ground, and it will massively overestimate that. So that's just a technical point, just be wary of that. Thank you.
I'll just come back on that one, Ruth. The tree measure in the outcomes framework is canopy area. So, yeah. Don't mix them. Absolutely not, no.
Thanks, Ruth. Janet, then Martin. Janet Dovdale.
Yeah, thank you. Simon, I always enjoy it when you come to talk to us because it's sort of mind-blowingly interesting for me, but maybe I'm also a bit of a geeky as well. Yeah, that's true. Now I became one.
So was she.
I was lucky, along with Ruth, to get sort of early doors on this a few months ago, and it's fabulous to see how far it's come forward. Got a hard question for you, first of all, which I sort of know the answer to, but I'm going to ask. This is looking at the here and now in terms of cover. Is there a possibility in the future to use this approach to put in parameters relating to climate change so we can start using it to model potential habitat change for our climate adaptation work? My second question is really a sort of marketing one. That map that is the final one you put up is just so cool. It's just fantastic. We could actually use that in our branding, commercialisation. I can see a jigsaw for it, all sorts of things. I just want that map on my wall.
It'll cost you, Janet.
Yeah.
Simon.
Yes, your first question. Data of this quality absolutely is useful for modelling. That's why we're using it in Morwich Hill and North Leeds. And that, in terms of digital twins, which I think is what you're talking about, which is where we use a model of the current landscape and we apply different factors to that landscape and examine what happens, that's absolutely one of our aspirations for this map. And certainly when, again, tying back to our conversations about climate change, tying back to conversations about water treatment within the landscape, those kinds of things, these kind of data will underpin that beautifully. But yes, of course. But it's, again, it comes back to funding us to do that. Or someone, and that's where this close working with universities is extremely useful. Because they can do that stuff and we don't really need to get too involved. But
And providing Janet with a copy of the map.
I think you probably need to send in a postal order to David Alexander in the strategy team for that one.
Does he know what the postal order is?
No. He is young. Okay, thank you. Martin Beer.
Right. The high resolutions that you're actually working at give quite a lot of other information as well. Have you looked at, for instance, for conservation purposes, landscape features, such as ancient field areas and where enclosure fields, whether it's medieval field structures or enclosure field structures, for example?
I didn't include that project in this talk, but Sue got me having a look at that, what was it, 18 months ago or something like that, and I did some digitisation around that. We looked at the 1950s map. We used the 1950s map when I reinterpreted the park boundary 12 years ago, whenever it was, and we got those tiles from the National Library of Scotland, and we took a look at that. And what that piece of early work has now turned into is that David has now got another research project funded by UKRI with South Downs National Park Authority and Lancaster University, and we're pulling off the old boundaries from the 1950s mapping and comparing it to the modern field boundaries and looking at the differences there. It's also branched into other field features. The old maps are very good at recording areas of marshland and all that kind of stuff, so they're examining in that sort of sense. So yes, Martin, that's absolutely, that's another strand. It opens all those kinds of doors to those kinds of questions, and that's interesting in terms of landscape change, landscape harm, monitoring change in the cultural environment as well as in the natural environment.
And presumably the only limiter is going to be resources, both in terms of staff and finance.
Sing it with me, everybody.
Yeah. I just thought, harmonise.
I was particularly thinking of the South Downs, actually.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Charles Green.
Yeah, thanks. Do you know, obviously the previous ones, the human ones, would have had an error rate. Yeah. Do you know what the comparison is between the error rates on the human side and on the AI side?
Yes, it's actually in the paper. And I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, Charles, you have to forgive me. But it was very close. I mean, certainly in major classes, the AI was just as good as a human, and it was really close at the classes below that. So, it will get better the more. Bear in mind, this was done by a PhD student on 9 months out. We had £15,000, and David's spare time spent on this. So not a bad achievement really. So yeah, and that accuracy is improving now. Dan and David are working on the model that's being used at Morridge Hill and North Lees, and the accuracy is improving with each pass.
Yeah.
So they're ironing that out.
Yeah. And then just going back to some other members' comments, do we own the IP? Do we own the intellectual property right on this? Are we actually going to be able to?
Okay, so the work was funded by the Turing Project. And we've done the work. So I'm not an intellectual property lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. We certainly have some rights over it, but also it had public money put into it in the form of David and mine's time. So well, I think there's a judgment to be made there about. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. Who
It is open access data, isn't it?
yes, the data, DOI.
Angela, the authority solicitor, said she'll have a look into that and see if she can...
Lovely, because I think there's plenty of scope to use this on other applications, whether it's like BNG assessments, ordnance survey might want it, as long as anybody else involved in land management.
But if nothing else, it may well be shared with our partners at Cranfield and so on.
Yeah, they need to get on country file.
Just a note on the IPR, it would initially be owned by the student, and if it's been open sourced, it will then become under the open source license.
Something to sort out, but Sue Fletcher has something to say?
Yes, just might be useful to share that there was a great deal of care taken over various contracts that we entered into over the IP. So largely, my understanding is that it will remain with us, apart from what the university want as their own. So there is this split. If one party brings something that's their IP, they retain it, and usually we give each other a cross license to use it. Can't remember.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. It might be useful to have a word with Angela so that she can just send us out a note to confirm what the position is, so we're confident that we're adopting the right course of action. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Ken Richardson.
Yeah, I was just wondering where you get your actual original photos from. Is it Google Earth?
The aerial photography is available. Is from Blue Sky, which is the. Sorry, thank you, Phil. Aerial photography is from Blue Sky, which is the trading arm of the Ordnance Survey, or part of the trading, I think, it's the Ordnance Survey. Someone will tell me that's wrong at some point, probably, but
Carry on.
but we get that free. We fit in with local authorities, in that we can all access that high resolution data free. What we can't get is the next stage down, which is I think it's 5 centimetre data. Ruth will correct me if I'm wrong. I think. But it gets better than that if you can pay more for it. But yeah, we get that free, and it's every year, or it comes out regularly. The set is refreshed on a rolling programme.
Okay, thanks, Simon. James Werrison.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not going to get into Janet's Athena posters necessarily here, but I do think that there is some way of commercialising this or showcasing this. It goes back to the comm strategy. You know, we're leading on this piece of work. Is there not some basis of them, some sort of conference or some sort of showcase to really, you know, add respect to the thinking that Simon and team and David bring to this process? I mean, I know that would be time consuming, but who knows? You might get the new combined authority mayor excited or some such, and quite rightly so.
We've done some of that, James.
Yeah?
Kate Lacey from National Parks England and myself went to the British Ecological Society conference along with a few others, and we had a large poster there talking about it there. We've talked to to Nottingham County, who were interested in using the model in some of their municipal sites, which is quite interesting. So they're looking at training up the AI to look at in city places rather than the wider countryside. So yeah, some of that's been done. But you're right. I mean, we could. It's a really good. If nothing else, I think Jackie said it this morning. It's something I've said as well. It's a really good conversation starter. This piece of work. It really is. It works with landowners. It works with farmers, and it works with everybody else as well. It's just like because it's so visually appealing, but also it's really easy to see just how useful something like this can be.
Just on that conference issue, a completely different thing it brings to mind. Another of the hats I wear is that of President, aka Chair of Sheffield's Hunter Archaeological Society. And in conjunction with the University of Sheffield and the Yorkshire Archaeological Society, there's an aerial photography conference next year, which it might be useful to talk about whether there's an opportunity there. So Yeah. Okay, thanks, James. Andrew Gregory.
I think, sorry, my point was covered, really, Chair, by the point about the just making certain the IPR has been agreed with.
Okay.
Angela's going to look at that.
Yeah.
Just while I've got the floor, the only thing I would say is thank you very much. Great presentation.
Indeed.
Perhaps the journalist who wrote the article for The Guardian about national parks being mostly constituted of white male men, which is obviously me. Perhaps they'd like to hear a bit more about what great work's going on here.
Indeed. At least you didn't suggest that you were bloated either, Andrew. Well, I think we'll move hastily on. If there are no further comments or questions, I think echo our thanks to Simon for updating us on progress with the use of AI, and from the earlier presentations in Members Forum, how already it's being applied. So thank you very much. Yep. If we... All right. If we can, in that case, move on to agenda item 9, which is the annual complaint performance and service improvement report. Now, who's dealing with that? Can't remember. Ruth?
Yeah.
Are you doing that? Oh, yeah, of course. The recommendation is on the screen behind me, so my head is probably obscuring it. But Angela is going to talk us through a quick introduction.
Yep, so really quick, thank you, Chair. The report is self-explanatory and shows the picture in relation to complaints and information requests dealt with by the authority over the past year. Members will see from the appendices that we've had a positive report from the Ombudsman, no maladministration, and there's no issues which needed to be reported to the Information Commissioner. So that's a positive report, shows the authorities being run well. That's just the summary I wanted to say, if there's any questions.
Okay, thanks, Angela. So we're a well-run organisation in terms of complaints, so you can pat your collective backs on that. Are there any comments or questions? Excellent. If there are no comments or questions, the recommendation is on the screen behind me and in the hard copies for those of you who have them. Can I have someone move the recommendation? Andy, thank you. Second. Ken Rustage, thank you very much. All those in favour? Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you, members. That's carried. This is the first time now we have an innovation that's come from the Governance Working Party for brief reports from the chairs of Programme and Resources and Planning Committee. So the first item, 10, is a brief report from, in this case, Charles Greaves, who is the Vice Chair of Programmes and Resources, because he chaired that last meeting. So, Charles.
Thank you, yeah. So we covered a couple of themes, quite a bit on carbon and climate change. So the first one was the climate change aims, which was presented by Simon. So just picked up on the fact that we've signed up for the Race to Zero, which is to get to net zero by 2040 rather than 2050. And some concerns regarding how we're actually going to measure those Scope 3 indirect emissions. So that would be, well, we're still waiting for guidance on how exactly that's going to come. But there's concern also on the vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. I think that's an area that we're all keen to learn more on. Then we had Matt, who came in with the carbon management plan, which was an annual update. And I think that the big take home from that was that it was noted that the tenement farms at Warslow are our biggest emitters. But total emissions were 4% down over the year, and we're 62% of the way on the journey to net zero. We had an update on occupational safety and health. I've never quite figured out why it's not health and safety, but anyhow. So there was that was from Teresa, and the main focus there was perhaps on our concerns over underreporting. There's been an increase in mental well-being issues, but support's been put in place for that. And we've also now started on our OS&H shared support across the national parks. We had a Part B item, so I'm only going to cover it in modest detail, and that was regarding the insurance renewal. So that was to give delegation for officers to go out to through DCC for procurement. I think the main bit there was concerns over the potential increases, and obviously that within the actual decision was to give officers that mandate to go out there and get the cover. But we'll all be keen to see exactly what that comes back as. And then there was something that cropped up in between time. So this is something that myself and Janet, as chair and vice chair, get involved with, and that's regarding Knoll House Farm. So the tenancy has been let with a focus on environmental management and education, and the new tenant should be moving in shortly. And if there's an opportunity for it, it might be nice for a visit there next summer to see what things are looking like on the ground.
Yep, good point. Something for officers to consider. Thank you, Charles. I meant to say, of course, that the reason for this introduction is to enable the chairs of our two other committees to update members on issues that they felt were important from their relative committees, in bearing in mind that we split our membership half and half between the two committees, and it's not always the case that every member is able to read and absorb the papers from the committee other than the one they're on, for any variety of reasons. So it's an opportunity just to get that bit of an overview. So thank you, Charles. Any quick questions or comments? If not, thank you very much. And we can move on to item 11. Patrick Brady, as chair of planning committee, has circulated a paper, which I shall assume that everyone has read. Are there any questions or comments of Patrick? If not, thank you, Patrick, for circulating that information to enable members to get an idea of what's considered to be important from planning committee. Okay, if in that case we move on to agenda item 12, which is reports from outside bodies, and none have been submitted. And I think that concludes this meeting just before 1 o'clock. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank members. Today was the second time that we've run a members forum prior to authority, and I was really pleased to see how many members, 25 of our membership, were able to attend. And it's something that I want to avoid doing so it doesn't become habit forming, but it was an opportunity today with a live